Good evening. I'm your host, Karen Hudis, in this series on the Network of Global Corporate Control. Today's segment is about Yemen. For 10 years, between 1986 and 1996, I was the World Bank country lawyer for Yemen. I was also the country lawyer for Jordan. I want you to understand Yemen's history and meet the good people of Yemen. Peace in Yemen holds the key to peace in the rest of the world, because the secrets hidden in Yemen's history help us to untangle the conflicts that trouble our world. Yemen's future is our future. Yemen is south of Saudi Arabia and just across from Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Djibouti, and Ethiopia. The border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen is disputed, but that has always been the case. One reason why Yemen is a forgotten war is that there are so many other wars happening in the region. The Syrian civil war, the Iraqi war against ISIS, Turkey's war with the PKK, the Libyan conflict, and so on. The old city of Sana'a, which is Yemen's capital, is a World Heritage Site. Here is what it looks like today after Saudi bombing. We will talk about what this year-old war is all about a little bit later. First, let me talk about Yemen's history and its people. As far as religion goes, historians believe that King Solomon's trading and naval networks brought Jews to Yemen from Judea around 900 BC. The first evidence of Jewish presence in Yemen can be traced to the 3rd century AD. In the early part of Jewish settlement in Yemen, the Jewish presence in the country was very strong. Many Himyatis who ruled at the time converted to Judaism. Sometime after the 3rd century AD, the Himyarite ruling family converted to Judaism. Judaism was the ruling religion. The Jewish rule lasted until 525, when the Christians from Ethiopia took over. The Hebrew that is spoken by Yemenite Jews is the closest to the way Hebrew was spoken during biblical times. Ethiopian rule ended in the 7th century with the Muslim conquest. In 1547, the Turks took over the region. In 1630, the Zaydis took over Yemen from the Turks. In 1679, part of the Jewish community of central Yemen was expelled to Mawza, which is a city on the southern shore of the Red Sea. About a year later, the Jews were taken back to central Yemen for economic reasons. The Jews were a vital asset to the economy of Yemen because they made up a majority of the craftsmen and artisans, and I'm wearing a beautiful example of Yemeni crafts. The Jews were silversmiths. The 18th century brought about a brief resurgence of Jewish life in Yemen with the rule of the imamis. Synagogues were rebuilt, and some Jews achieved important positions. For example, Rabbi Shalom ben Abram became responsible for minting and for the royal coffers. In the 19th century, the imamis lost power. In 1872, the Turks took over Yemen again. In 1882, Jewish immigration to Palestine from Yemen began. In 1883, Jews were barred from leaving Yemen for this purpose, but they continued to emigrate anyway. It was a small number, with peaks in 1908, 1911, 1929, and 1943. The number climaxed in 1948 when Israel was declared a state. By 1950, Almost all of the Yemenite Jews had relocated to Israel. In 2009, the Jewish population of Yemen numbered around 400. Today, however, there remains only approximately 90 Jewish people in Yemen, the majority of whom live in the Sana'a compound. In the Old Testament book of Ezekiel as a trading partner with Tyre, the harbor was first used between the 5th and 7th centuries BC by the kingdom of Asan. Being about the same distance from Bombay and Zanzibar, the ancient port of Aden was a way station for seagoing vessels and people. They stopped there to get supplies, particularly fresh water. Arab historians describe the first fortifications in the port of Aden to Beni Zureya, who built the structures to protect the village from its enemies and to control the movement of goods in the area in order to prevent smuggling. The original fortifications were rebuilt in 1175 AD. The port of Aden is an ancient seaport. Marco Polo visited the port in the 11th century. The Chinese emperor from the Ming dynasty sent an envoy with gifts to the king of Aden in 1421. In the 19th century, it was an important ship fueling port for steamers. After the Suez Canal opened, the port of Aden became one of the busiest ship bunkering, duty-free shopping and trading ports in the world. In 1838, the British took the port of Aden and over 19,000 hectares in the state of Lahej. In 1839, the British East India Company occupied the territory. The British held the port of Aden until 1967. Until 1937, the port of Aden was considered part of British India and was called the Aden Settlement. In 1937, the settlement was separated from India, becoming the British Crown Colony of Aden. After the British lost the Suez Canal in 1956, the port of Aden became the main British base for the region. The port of Aden Colony was made part of the Federation of Arab Emirates of the South in 1963. Later, the region was renamed the Federation of South Arabia. In 1963, resistance to British rule began. Riots broke out in the port of Aden in 1967, and the British left the area in late 1967. In 1970, the port of Aden became the capital of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. British Petroleum turned the oil refinery over and tanker port in the port of Aden to the Yemeni government in 1977. When the Suez Canal was closed in the 1970s, traffic through the port of Aden declined. New quays were built in the 1980s to improve the competitive position and meet the demands of the changing maritime trade industry. By the end of the 1980s, the port of Aden had capacity to handle all types of dry cargo and modern containers. When North and South Yemen were united in 1990, the port of Aden became the capital of the Aden Governorate. The unification of North and South Yemen was very difficult, and my friends in the government from South Yemen would tell me of some of the problems they faced. It was when they told me how the corruption was preventing the World Bank from financing a port project for Aden, and I reported this back to Ibrahim Shihada, that I was reassigned to the Philippines. I wanted to keep on working in the Middle East and told my boss, Ibrahim Shihada, that, but he told me I was needed in the Philippines. An Israeli whistleblower named Barry Kamish, who is now living in the United States, has this to say about what happened to 4,500 babies of Yemeni immigrants. And I'm now quoting from an email from Barry Kamish. Quote, "We know Zionism has many layers. Basically, the labor Zionists who founded Israel and the conservative and religious Zionists who they hunted and victimized. In the mid-90s, they made a huge mistake by murdering Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in a highly flawed plot, which I easily uncovered. The idea was to blame religious conservatives for the murder, but I showed in a best-selling book, Who Murdered Yitzhak Rabin? It didn't wash. So impressed by my success was Rabbi Meshullam that he invited me to his home, and there I saw the fruits of his success. A Sephardic Uncle Tom, Police Minister Moshe Shahad, had sent some 2,000 ground troops to surround Meshullam's home and shoot it up. I counted 60 bullet holes in the walls before getting the picture. One of his congregants, Shlomo Asulun, died in the barrage. Why all the police terror to shut down Rabbi Meshullam? In the 1950s, immigrants from Yemen, knowing little Hebrew and unable to defend themselves, saw their children by the thousands disappear in Israel. Rabbi Meshullam estimated 4,500 lost babies, of whom 4,000 were shipped to America in cages, and he acquired photos of the cages. 500 were sent for adoption in Israel, and the ever-sophisticated Attorney General Miriam Ben-Porat got a daughter by this means. I had to wonder why. The next time I met Rabbi Meshullam, I found out why. This time it was in a basement lockup of Sharon prison. He blasted religious music and revealed, in the 1950s, Shimon Peres was head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. It seems not enough was known about the effects of radiation on human beings. He promised the Americans a unique people to experiment on in return for their knowledge to turn Israel nuclear. The children died ghastly deaths, and Peres later organized the murder of Rabin, which brought me and Meshullam together. He asked me to be his movement spokesman, but it was by then far too infiltrated for me to have a chance. If you care to know how deep this infiltration is, Google Hammeragalim to watch the likes of Rav Avinar or Itamar ben Gvirat at work, or get Alisa Bashamachem's book, Banished, through me. Till then, satisfy yourselves with a letter from a correspondent thanking me for keeping the issue alive, followed by a chance to hear me in English or Hebrew, and concluding with a new book review from the left-wing Haaretz. Rabbi Meshullam returned from Sharon prison, an invalid unable to continue his quest for justice. I escaped to America under duress, but the Yemenite babies won't go away. Just as another Jew stole a potato from another Jew in Auschwitz to survive, the sick Ben-Gurion thought that you can kidnap babies from Mitzrayim to strengthen the political parties. The means justify the ends for Mapai, Mapam, Independent Liberals, NRP, parent party of Naftali Bennett, and Aguda. These are people that Hitler loathed and that we never knew growing up in our nice, idyllic suburban Jewish community in Cleveland. Not only hasn't the world learned from the Holocaust, but neither has the Jewish world. Jewish Family Service in the USA and in South America distributed the illegal kidnapped babies to needy childless families or naive Jewish people who wanted to help acculturate supposed deprived babies from the new Jewish state. Unfortunately, if kids were not given for illegal adoption in Israel, they were sold at halfway homes run by pioneer women, and mostly Wizo in Israel, and sold abroad. As you know, I have researched this since 1985. Israeli media led by Mapai has censored this issue since 1966. The second and third generation of Yemenites are organizing lawsuits now against the State of Israel. Hundreds now mass in Israel every 2 to 3 months spontaneously, so the Israeli intelligence community will not thwart the events. Israeli organized crime was part of kidnapping network, as was Israeli medical establishment. The phenomenon has occurred since 1944 until 1973. Hadassah Ein Karim has the biggest criminal role in the process. Hadassah got payback from Madoff in return for their stealing billions from Holocaust survivors via the claims and participating in the kidnapping of 10,000 babies from Yemen, Iraq, and the Balkans, mostly from 1949 to 1956, and in the infirmaries and hospitals of Israel. A serious book on the subject is coming out by Routledge Press soon. There's also a novel in Israel about the kidnapping of Yemeni children called Galbi by Iris Elia Cohen. And it's about Zohara, a lawyer of Yemenite descent in her early 30s, who was born and raised in Haifa. She's a divorcee with one child. The novel opens at the beginning of the 1980s when Zohara visits a family living near Jerusalem in an attempt to trace her twin sister, Batya, who disappeared 30 years earlier. Batya was taken away by a doctor and a nurse. They promised to bring her back but did not do so. The mother, a young woman who at the time didn't know Hebrew, had tried to track down the girl ever since, but in vain. Galbi, which means my heart in Yemeni Arabic, is based on the assumption that a more or less organized kidnapping of Yemenite children was perpetrated in Israel under Ashkenazi rule in the state's formative years, out of a desire to give the children a better life than they would have had with their biological parents. The protagonist puts it like this: I have nothing against Ashkenazim in general, but in a very specific way, some of them are responsible for the greatest, most serious crime committed here since the state was established. That comment sums up the book's spirit rather well. The novel is a grave indictment, replete with stereotypes and prejudices of the Ashkenazim and the crimes they allegedly committed against the Mizrahim Jews of Middle Eastern or North African origin. Now let's talk about the war in Yemen. This year-old war, the reason for it? It has vast quantities of petroleum and natural gas. The network of global corporate control toppled the sitting president in 2011, after which the sitting vice president was elected on a single candidate ballot as an interim president. To make a long story short, the Houthis boycotted the election. The former president, Ali Saleh, who was Shia, he joined with them, and a ceasefire broke down in early 2015, leading to open war. The Saudis have gathered other Sunni Muslim nations together with the US and the UK in a coalition and are killing civilians. It's a war of Sunni against Shiite Muslims. Saudi Arabia is saying that it can't allow a regime backed by Iran, which is Shiite, to be sharing its border. But this is misleading. Yemen has a Zaidi community which practices a version of Shiite Islam. They are the majority in the far north, but the minority in the country, there's a majority Shafi population who follow a version of Sunni Islam. These communities have intermarried and they pray in each other's mosques. While some regional divides and divisions in the political economy sometimes overlap with the Zaidi Shafi divides, there is no history in Yemen of sectarian conflict. To frame it in terms of sectarian conflict is therefore misleading. The Gulf Arab Coalition is conducting this war with behind-the-scenes support from Western governments and defense contractors, including the United States and UK. In this war, even Sudan has undertaken multiple deployments of squadrons flying the advanced Su-24 ground attack aircraft. The United Arab Emirates has been particularly impressive, but people should have seen that coming. The Emirates have been getting really serious, in part with French help, about developing a powerful military. The UAE has sent intervention forces to Lebanon, Somalia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, and now Yemen. The way this war has been conducted, it's clear that this is a war against the civilian population. The UN embargo blockade against Yemen and the Yemenis violates Genocide Convention Article 2E because it's deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This is from Professor Francis Boyle. The fighting in Yemen has killed more than 6,200 civilians and displaced millions. Yemen is a country that even before this current conflict was moving towards a humanitarian crisis. It's a country that's 90% dependent on imports for its food, and it's already running out of water in critical cities. With a blockade, Yemen is facing a hunger and malnutrition crisis throughout the country, and this fighting is obviously only accelerating the crisis in an acute and alarming way. The airstrikes have targeted critical infrastructure for the movement of goods and have also targeted electrical plants and hospitals and markets. The network of global corporate control is hoping, through the plight of Yemen, to paint Saudi Arabia as a villain responsible for the 9/11 attack in New York. The forever-changing 9/11 story is entering a new phase. Blame is being transferred from Osama bin Laden to the Saudi Arabian government. There are 28 pages classified secret of a congressional inquiry into 9/11 that allegedly found Saudi financial support for the alleged 9/11 hijackers. Neither the George W. Bush nor the Obama regimes would release the classified pages. Only a few members of Congress have been permitted to read it, and they are not permitted to speak about it. Nevertheless, Congress now has before it the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which, if passed, permits families of victims of the 9/11 attacks to sue the Saudi Arabian government for damages. What is clear is that the network of global corporate control is hoping that people are going to be sufficiently preoccupied with blaming each other for the endless conflicts in the Middle East that they're not going to see the puppet masters that are inciting the conflicts. During the 10 years that I worked on the Middle East as country lawyer for Yemen and Jordan, I got involved in the water issues. I published a study on how to prevent conflict over the water shortages. I traveled to Israel in a taxi from Jordan and tried to get the World Bank to finance a computer simulation model for Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the West Bank so that droughts would not lead to conflict. I was basing this proposed project on a project that was introduced in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, which enabled the parties to see how their use of water would affect the other parties. The groundwater under the West Bank accounts for most of the water in that water-scarce region, and it's not shared equitably. The World Bank prevented me from pursuing that project. It took me a long time to find out why. It's because the network of global corporate control, which had taken over the World Bank in state capture instead of the Board of Governors, did not want peace in the Middle East. This Saudi coalition against Yemen is intended to preserve the illegal military regime in the United States, which masterminded the 9/11 attacks. But this is not fooling the Coalition for the Rule of Law on the Board of Governors of the World Bank and IMF, which is responsible for the United States monetary gold reserves. I'm told that I had some time to talk to you extemporaneously. So let me tell you about what happened in some of the projects that I was working on in the Middle East. You may wonder how a Jewish woman would be welcomed in Yemen, but I was. It took me about 5 years, actually, and because I didn't speak Arabic, I was afraid to. I was afraid that some of the words that I would pronounce would be pronounced similar to Hebrew. So I just didn't, I didn't really try. But I did go there, and I worked very hard to do the projects that they thought were useful for them. And so after 5 years, one of the things that happened to me, it was late at night, and I was getting into my taxi, and somebody was throwing rocks at my legs. So I thought probably it would be a better idea to wear something long. And I wore the black abaya. And after I did that, I had no problems whatsoever. I would, in Yemen, I would go to the meetings, and I would be the only woman there. And then after the meetings, I would go to various functions with women. I was one of the few people working at the World Bank who got to see what the women of Yemen were like. And it was a wonderful experience. They were extremely hospitable. And I found out I could predict very early on whether a project was going to be successful or not. I had 2 indicators to look at. The first was whether the person at the World Bank would chew cot. They would have long cot chewing sessions, and the custom was anything that you said after 2 or 3 hours in a cot chewing session would not be taken again, would not be held against you. And so that meant that the people who spent their time getting to know the people that they were working with on the projects would find out what was really going on in the project. So that was one indicator. And then I would count the number of cars in a project. And if a project had a lot of cars, it meant that that was a project that the Yemenis really were not interested in. If there were enough cars, then they would consent to have the project. I want to thank you for listening to another segment of the Network of Global Corporate Control. We've been talking about Yemen, a jewel in the Middle East. It's an Arab nation which was predominantly Jewish in its early history, what has happened to Yemen's Jews, and the cruel war against the Yemeni people meant to distract us from the illegal regime in the United States.